I can't see you at all, though.
Yeah, I know. It's kind
I
of
can't
weird.
see any questions either.
Well, I'm taking care of that. So
Oh, wow. Okay.
All right. All right. Welcome, everybody. Really excited to have you all here. Hello, Marjorie. Welcome. We're really excited to have everybody joining us. My name is Brian Roth from Sercante, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to cover. Just remember, all the sessions are being recorded. They'll be available on demand after the event, and we'll also be following up with them by email. So don't worry. If you have a question, just drop them into the Q&A tab above in the chat section, and I'll be answering them live, typing out answers live during the during the session where I can, and if not, we'll have time at the end, hopefully, for some Q&A. Now let's get started. Really happy to introduce our speaker today. I handpicked this session because I wanted to work with Jen Kazin from Green Key. Jen has been in this ecosystem for quite a while, for the past 8 years or so, I think. And she's also the leader of the Twin Cities Pardot user group, or account engagement user group. She has a great session for us today. It's a deep dive into account engagement automations. So super excited about this, and take it away, Jen.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian, for such a nice introduction. I'm also very happy to be working with you again once more. So thank you for that. All right. So I want to get started with my session, a deep dive into account engagement automations. So here's the items that I'm planning to talk about. We're going to talk about dynamic lists, automation rules, completion actions. I want to explain a resource that I have for you. And then we're going to have, we have like a try it out session, a little challenge, 5 questions. I have a little shout out at the top. I know a lot of people know me online, and sometimes people are like, oh, Jen's speaking, so I'm going to join it. But I also just want to explain, this is a beginner intermediate session. The reason I did this is because I'm a huge fan of Marjorie, and I'm actually planning to attend many of the sessions. And sometimes I go, wow, there's so many really good sessions. It's usually like the new, the latest, the greatest. And, consultants have solved for a really complex problem. And I'm like, wow, sometimes people just need to learn how to use account engagement more. And so that was kind of the inspiration of this topic. So it's, like I said, dynamic list automation rules, completion actions. Those are common automation tools that have been available for some time now in account engagement. So it's kind of reviewing of the basics. One thing that I do want to shout out is the resource. What I did to make it a little bit more than just describing the automations, the resource actually has, I call it an automation cookbook. So I have basically 33 examples of dynamic list automations, completion actions, or dynamic list automation rules and completion actions. So what you can get started with that. So I actually think that resource is really valuable and helpful. So I would at least stick around for that as well. So let's get started. So I have dynamic lists. So I'm starting out with this picture. So I'm going to actually tell a quick story. So I have 3 kids. They're older now, but when they were in elementary school, I would chaperone, and we'd go to the science museum. And the teachers at our elementary school would always put the kids in bright orange shirts. Like there was our school color. So either the kids wore orange or they gave them an orange shirt. But it was super helpful for the parent chaperones, because we could literally look across the room and be like, okay, which kid is mine that I'm watching? Oh yeah, there's the 5 or 8 kids that I'm supposed to keep an eye on. So it became really easy. And the reason I'm telling this story is it's kind of like the essence of what a dynamic list is. Like, I know we're like now in the world of account engagement, we're not going to a science museum, but in the kind of the same concept, if I basically said, I want everybody who is wearing an orange shirt, I could create a dynamic list, and I could say orange shirt equals orange. And then it would show, here's the name of all the people with orange shirts. And so like, that's the principal concept of a dynamic list. It allows you to basically go into your database and pull out certain people that you might be trying to target. Maybe you're targeting a region, like everyone from the West Coast, or a certain industry, or a certain product interest, right? Because I'm going to send a very targeted email for them. And so like that dynamic list gets used quite a bit. So here's where you go ahead and do that. So I have the dynamic list. This is where you can add prospects to the list automatically. That's how a dynamic list works. This list, a dynamic list, continuously updates on its own, pulling prospects when they match the criteria. And a dynamic list will automatically remove them when they don't match. So for instance, if I created, again, a dynamic list on orange shirts, I could say everyone with an orange shirt, it might pull in 100 names. And now I said, oh, wait, I just made a mistake. This one here should have been a blue shirt. So I go in the database and I correct it. So one prospect now has a blue shirt that initially was orange. I don't have to do anything with my dynamic list. I can just wait 5 or 10 minutes, and all of a sudden, where it was 100 names, one got changed, and now it will show 99. And then, of course, there's lots of things you can do with that dynamic list. But that dynamic list runs continuously. So once you create it, it's constantly running, looking for prospects to match the criteria that you specify. Common uses of dynamic lists, it's to complete automations. Like I said, well, of course, you're going to use a dynamic list to send an email, but you can always also use it to complete automations, like use it in your engagement studio, use it to delete prospects or tag prospects. Maybe you're going to create a dynamic list to delete free emails or to suppress competitors or vendors, right? So there's many reasons why you use dynamic lists. I remember talking to another really experienced account engagement consultant, and I was on the newer side, so this was a long time ago, but I'm like, what do you use the most? And she goes, I use dynamic lists all the time. She's like, of course, it's just for emails, but it's always a step in a process of automation that she's doing. So she said, sometimes I'll just create one to just look into the system. Like how many vice presidents do we have in the system? She's like, I'm not sure. She'll just create a dynamic list and then could get that number, and then she would just delete it. So again, once you start to use dynamic lists, you use them all the time. So once you create a dynamic list, what you're going to find is your title. So here you have match all or match any. So this is where you start with a dynamic list, and you actually will choose. I'm going to choose either match all or match any. And here we have match all. Match all actually means state is Hawaii and industry apparel. When you use match all, that means and. That means they must be in both, and that's where you have the overlap there. Match any is or. That is state is Hawaii or industry is apparel. So that means you can be in both. So these are the operators that you can choose to create your criteria. So now I'm going to just create a quick dynamic list for anyone with at Gmail, or so anyone with a Gmail account or anyone with a Hotmail account. So you can see here's an example of a dynamic list. The prospect default field email contains at Gmail or at Hotmail. And then you can actually, like you said, this is actually going to run. You can either preview it. So if I wanted to, I could just not officially run it, just hit preview to see how many people would qualify. Or I could hit run rules, and therefore that would kick off that dynamic list. And as long as that dynamic list is out there, it would continuously look through the database for that. And also you can notice the separators here. In account engagement, I'm using a semicolon. So when I use at Gmail or at Hotmail, in Salesforce, that's a comma. In account engagement, that is a semicolon. All right. Next, we're going to chat about automation rules. Here's my life concept. The concept of what an automation rule is. I have a guy here. He just woke up in the morning. He put on his fuzzy flannel and he's having a cup of coffee, and he can have a cup of coffee right away because he has it made with his automatic coffee maker. So an automation rule is some type of a way that you set something up in the system to happen automatically. In his instance, he actually set up the coffee maker the day before so that when he woke up, basically his coffee would be ready to go sitting there for him. And similar concept with an automation rule, it's a way you automate things in the system. Many times people are using account engagement and they're simply sending emails, right? They get as far as a dynamic list and they're creating lists and sending emails. But you might want to take that a step further and be like, how can we start to automate this? How do we make this so like prospects are automatically getting assigned? So prospects are automatically getting into engagement studio programs. There's lots of different things that you can automate. And automation rules is how you make that happen. So automation rules, they're like the heavy lifters in the automation toolbox in account engagement. They're more powerful and flexible, which makes them a popular choice when you're trying to do different types of automations. So here with automation rules, you go to the automation tab, and then you go to automation rules, and then you could choose add automation rules. So automation rules are built from criteria and actions. So just like a dynamic list, which is based off criteria, remember how I said like everyone with an orange shirt, like that was my criteria for my dynamic list. Same principle in an automation rule. It's built with criteria. So you would specify everybody in the manufacturing industry or everybody from the state of Michigan. So you would establish who out of your database would qualify with an automation rule with criteria. And then you have an action is applied to those prospects to actually match. So the automation rules, they continuously look for prospects who match the rule criteria. So those dynamic lists, remember how I mentioned those are going to run continuously? Automation rules do the same thing. So every 10 minutes, it's going to review the criteria that you specify in the automation rule and look for matches in your database. So whether it's midnight, it could be, on a holiday where you're like your mind is the farthest place away from work. Those automation rules and dynamic lists will constantly be running. And I used to always kind of laugh sometimes. I'll be like, I remember working once and it was like New Year's Eve and it was, I don't know, it was like 11:30 p.m. And I remember like someone was filling out a form. I'm like, wow, what are they doing? Why are they at work? Or why are they filling out a form for like our content that's very work oriented? But like I said, those systems are working all the time, even when we're not. One item about an automation rule is they are retroactive. So one of those things, an example of that is for instance, like scoring. If, for instance, the scoring is changed, you have to make sure that you're careful to turn off your automation rules, because even if you created, when you create that automation rule, it's going to look back to see anybody in the database that qualifies for that. And so sometimes that can catch you a little off guard. So you might want to think about the criteria very carefully, and you'll want to test your automation rules or preview them before you actually move forward with them. So once you create an automation rule, here's just an example that I have for here. So I have an automation rule, which is like match any. So I'm using match any, which is using the operator or. So job title is vice president or employees is greater than 10,000. So this is my criteria. So these are my rules at the top. And then you can see actions is adjust the prospect score by plus 15. So in my layman's term, I would say if job title is vice president or employees is greater than 10,000, so maybe that's what I'm targeting, right? I'm looking for big titles, like a vice president title, or people from big companies, and big companies is employees greater than 10,000. So that's my criteria. And what do I want to do? Well, they're my targeted audience. So then I want to increase that score by 15. And automation rules is the only toolbox and the only tool that you can use to adjust, score, I should say. Actually, I got to take that back because you can do it with a completion action too. But I think I see automation used most commonly for scoring. If you're doing scoring, you're usually using an automation rule for adjusting your score. So what are some of the things that you can do with an automation rule? So here in this example, you can see I just took a screenshot, and it's like, there's a list, but you can see it's just a screenshot, so I can't pull down the scroll bar. So on the right, I actually just wrote down, like, here's all the different actions that you can do with an automation rule. So you add prospect to a list, adjusting score. So I mentioned that, like, adjusting scoring and doing scoring, you're often using automation rules for that, scoring or grading. You can see there's like 4 different ways to assign. You can assign to a queue or a user or Salesforce. And heads up, like, the reason you might want to assign is because if you have a prospect that is simply in account engagement and now they need to get into Salesforce, the action you do to move them from account engagement into Salesforce to create a lead is to assign it. So you can see that's a really common choice. Change prospect custom field value or default field value. Again, that's a very common thing to do as well, especially if you're like tracking lead sources. Like, you're going to need to be able to change that lead source if it's empty. Notifications are common, tagging, adding tags or removing tags. So I didn't go through all of them, but just kind of generally spoke to some of the ones that I see commonly used. So here's my example. So if a prospect filled out a form, I'm going to assign them to sales via a lead assignment rule. So here is a prospect form. So anyone who filled out the form, we're going to assign via Salesforce active assignment rule. So again, 3 different choices for assignment. You could assign to a user, you could assign to a group, you can assign to a queue, and I'm actually going to assign via Salesforce active assignment rule. And what that means is that you probably have filled out, or this company would probably have filled out the lead assignment rules in Salesforce. So instead of managing it like the lead routing in both account engagement and Salesforce, you can say, hey, I don't want to have to rebuild the whole lead routing process and procedure. I'm simply going to use what we have in Salesforce. And so again, a common choice there is to assign via Salesforce active assignment rule. Next, let's talk about completion actions. All right. So far we've been talking about dynamic lists and automation rules. And kind of the symbolic life way of describing a completion action is I have like a vending machine here. So there's one thing that's very unique about a completion action is I say they're coin operated. So basically they trigger whenever somebody does something, like they have filled out a form, they have clicked on an email, right? They've clicked on a custom redirect. Those are all very common ways to trigger a completion action. So that's why I have a vending machine in here to kind of explain, like, it's very different. Previously, like I said, with dynamic lists and automation rules, they were criteria based, right? Based on some criteria that I might be keeping in my system. Like, they're interested in sports. Like if you sell t-shirts, it's part of a sport group or it's part of a church youth group. There's different product interests that might stem or might be your criteria, but that's not how a completion action works at all. Completion actions are based on a trigger that someone's actually doing, an actual action. So completion actions are a great way to automate actions from a marketing element. So for an example, you can use a completion action to add prospects to a list when they complete a form, or completion actions are available. They're also available on forms, form handlers, files, custom redirects, emails, and page actions. Honestly, on the day-to-day usage, I would say completion actions are really used primarily on emails and forms. You can see there's other ways to use them as well, but I feel like it's almost like 80%, 90%. The day-to-day stuff is completion actions getting used on an email or put on a form as well. And I was kind of talking a little bit earlier, triggering. So dynamic lists and automation rules, The trigger for those are criteria, whereas completion actions, those are basically triggered by actions like email, click, form submissions, etc. Here's an example of filling out a completion action by clicking on an email. So for instance, here, a prospect clicks on this email. And so what happens here is like you're about to send an email. So like you've prepared your email, your template is ready. You've already said here who I'm going to send the email to, and you've said who's the sender. So you filled all those elements out. And the next thing you're going to need to do is like, okay, if you scroll all the way to the bottom of that email, you'll see a section called completion actions. And then here's where you can decide, do I need to put any completion actions on this? So your first choice is a prospect opens this email. We tend not to choose that anymore. Since September of 2021, with the Apple Mail privacy protection, there's a lot of like Apple products are opening emails to provide a protection to see, so if people cannot, so you're not able to determine whether someone really opened it, so they just open everybody's email. So therefore, opens are no longer reliable. So I have checked here, prospect clicks in this email. And then you can see there's some different completion actions to choose from. I can add tags, tagging someone, add to a CRM campaign. I think that's really common. If you're a business that says, hey, we're not going to count opens anymore, but we will count clicks, that's a very common decision. So anyone who clicks in the email, we are going to add to the CRM campaign because maybe you're going to track campaign influence. Maybe it's a really important email. And so you're like, if somebody clicks on this email, we want to add to the score. So you can see adjust score as a choice there, the fourth one down, as well as notifying user, tagging, add to list, right? Maybe this is a new email. It's about dogs and you have a pet store. And so anyone who clicks in this email probably has some kind of interest in dogs. So then you could add them to a dog list, which then might kick off into an engagement studio program or an email drip. So here's a couple completion action considerations. Completion actions are not retroactive. They only apply to activities that happen after the completion action is added. So if you recall, this is like the opposite of an automation rule. You could say, I want to know everybody who registered for a webinar, and you're like, oh shoot, I forgot to set something. So I'll just create the automation rule now. That would go back and it would collect, okay, the 38 names that already registered. Completion action would not do that. If you went back into the form and now added a completion action on a form for a registration, if you missed 38 names, you'd have to find some other way to add them, because the completion actions are really, once they're set, it's going to move forward. It's only actions that happen after the completion action is added. Most completion actions execute every time they're triggered. However, there can be, completion actions based on email link clicks only execute once per prospect. And then if you have multiple completion actions, the system is smart enough to know generally which ones need to run in the correct order. So for an example, if your action is to assign to a user, notify a user, and set a custom field, account engagement, it will know which ones to do in order. So you don't have to worry about, oh, I got to make sure I do this one first and then make sure this completion action is second. Otherwise it wouldn't happen. The system does have some intelligence to kind of understand what you're trying to do and make sure it gets executed correctly. So here's a quick example, is that if a prospect fills out a form, we're going to add that prospect to the webinar campaign. So again, imagine this is a form and I'm going down to the bottom of the form and I'm going to choose. So like anytime somebody fills out this form, this is my webinar, I want to add them to the webinar campaign with a status of responded. So that means, just like I said, coin operated, anytime somebody fills out that form, as long as that prospect is in Salesforce, they will get added to the campaign webinar. And I did also add conditional completion actions on here. So this is not new. I think it's been out now it was like last summer it was new. So it's been over a year now. But you can see at the bottom, there's a choice. There's add action or add conditional group. So add action is simply adding a new completion action. So you can see at the top, add to campaign. That's going to happen to everybody. So everybody who fills out that form are going to get added to the webinar campaign. But you can see the second, it's kind of a grayed out box down below. That's actually a conditional group. And so it's actually kind of a powerful way of using completion actions. So now it's a blend of using criteria inside of a completion action that is originally usually only, like I said, the trigger acted or based on the action alone. So if I had to explain what this is doing, is that from the top, if somebody fills out this form, everyone's going to get added to the campaign. That's the top line. But down below, what's in gray, only the people where the country is United States is going to get assigned to a user named Brian Nelson. Okay. And so everyone will get executed. Everyone will get added to the campaign, but only prospects that also are of country of United States will then get assigned to Brian. So it allows you to have some element of criteria inside of your completion actions. Yep. And here's an example. If a prospect clicks in an email, we're going to adjust the score by +8. So I had a previous example was an example of a form. Here's an example of an email. So if they click in the link, any link, we're going to adjust the score by 8. And so again, these completions are actions. This one is at the bottom of any type of email that you send. So which ones do I use? So here's, I've modified this. The original source is from Salesforce. There's all kinds of versions of this floating around. But like I said, I'm just, explaining the 3 main ones. So what is the rule based on? So here's kind of like a decision tree. So if you think about what am I trying to do? So the first question is, what is the rule based on? Is it based on criteria or action? Okay. If it's based on an action, like I clicked on something, I filled out a form, then you would probably want to use a completion action. But if the rule is based on criteria, then let's go down to the next line there. Okay. So now, well, what is the desired outcome? If I simply want a list, I could use a dynamic list. Okay. So if it's criteria and I just need a list, your tool that you should use is a dynamic list. But if it's based on criteria and I need to do some action, like I need to do something, I need to assign it, I need to tag it, I need to adjust the score, update a field, then you would want to use an automation rule. So again, something that's helpful, I think when you're just getting started, take a screenshot, prop it up on your desk. So like all of a sudden when you find you're having to create an automation rule, it might help you make like the right decision quicker. I also like to give a quick shout out that it's actually okay. It's very common to think, hey, I think I'm going to do this with a dynamic list. And then you'll get started and you're like, okay, wait a minute, that's obviously not right. And then you just reverse out of that and you're like, okay, it's got to be an automation rule. That's right. Because I can't do a score with a dynamic list because a dynamic list is just a list. So again, very normal and common. So don't feel bad if you find yourself in that situation. I also added this section, like what does run continuously mean for automation rules and dynamic lists? So again, when people are just getting started with using account engagement, I think this sometimes trips people up. Run continuously. So for a dynamic list, you can see, I have said also, dynamic lists and automation rules run continuously. So they both do. They're constantly looking to find prospects that fit the criteria. But one difference is a dynamic list, prospects are added or removed from the list an unlimited number of times. Okay. But now if you look at the bottom of an automation rule, once a prospect is matched, it's a permanent member of the automation rule. So basically, I used to say you get lifetime membership. So once you match to an automation rule, it's matched. So here's my example. So at the top, I have a very basic example. So let's just say you have a custom field. Let's just say you sell fruit and you have a custom field for a type of fruit. Okay. And so you're going to run a criteria. This could either be a dynamic list or an automation rule at the top. Fruit is apple. Okay, fine. And now I'm going to read through each line down below. So if I have a prospect where fruit equals apple, you can see the dynamic list, that prospect will get added to the dynamic list and it will get added to the automation rule because it's matching, right? I have a rule that says fruit is apple and I have a prospect that has apple designated in that custom field. Okay, so it got it could get added to the dynamic list, and it might get added to the automation rule. Well, not might, it will get added to the automation rule. But now watch how the prospect, when the prospect value changes, how the dynamic list and automation rule differ now. So now if I go into that prospect and I change the fruit value to orange, the prospect then is going to get removed from the dynamic list. Because again, that's the dynamic nature of it. People can get added or taken off. Whereas that automation rule, you can see is that prospect will stay on that because it qualified initially. Once you get on an automation rule, you have that lifetime membership. You're going to stay on there. You can actually go back and now let's test it, right? Let's go change the fruit value back to apple. Wait 10 minutes, the dynamic list will pick that prospect name back up again, but you can see nothing has changed on the automation rule. And you can see, you can see the product, you can see it repeating as I'm changing to different fruits, even like banana. So I'm trying to keep this like a beginner level. So once you start to get more familiar with automation rules, there is like a repeat feature so that you can actually choose repeat. So that will allow that automation rule to work a little bit more like a dynamic list, and it gives you some control over it. Again, but I didn't cover that here. Another way to do it is that, for instance, like if you're like, wait a minute, this is not what I intended, like you can just go copy the automation rule and do another one if you need like all of a sudden somebody to requalify it. So lots of different ways to work around that. All right, so here's the resource that I was talking about. So I think, in my opinion, like some of these examples that I've been talking in the last half hour could be very elementary to you. And so I actually think this automation guide is actually really helpful, even if you're like an intermediate level user of account engagement. Because what I've done is like over the last X number of months, when I've, as I've been helping someone or I've seen something, I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I like how they did that automation rule. So the automation guide starts really simply, like examples that I have like in this presentation. But if you look towards the end, they actually get a lot more sophisticated, like scoring decay, a couple different examples of that, couple different examples of, a honeypot, so that if bots are clicking in your emails and that's been a problem for you, how you might want to handle that. So again, I actually think that's a really helpful guide. There's a QR code there for you, or you can actually click on that. Well, you can't click on the link, but you can type that link in, whichever is most convenient for you. But I actually think that's really helpful. I wish I had that, because I think it's not just about learning what the definition is of these tools. It's actually like seeing somebody use them. And then you start to be like, oh, I get it now, because I see what they're doing. Now that I've seen 3 or 4 of these, it helps with the understanding. All right, I'm watching time, Brian, so don't worry. Then hopefully we'll have
Jen,
some time.
We do have a bunch of questions. So yeah, just wanted to let you know that.
So what did you say, Brian? I think you broke up on me.
Sorry. Yeah, we do have a bunch of questions, so definitely.
All right, we'll buzz through this really quick then. All right, schedule so how would you challenge? So just write down like 1 to 5, and all we're gonna do is go through. I have like 5 questions, and like I said, they're pretty basic. Number 1, how would you add a prospect to an email nurture? So like this is like, again, let's apply what we just learned, right? So you're gonna either write number 1 is the answer for number 1, or option 2 is the answer for number 1. So would you create a dynamic list, add that dynamic list to an engagement studio, or create an automation rule to create a list and add that automation rule to the engagement studio? So I'm going to go through 5, and then I'll come back and give the answers. Next, add a prospect to a campaign when he, she, or they click on an email. Option 1, do you add a completion action to the email to add the prospect to a campaign when he, she, they click on the email? Or what is the right answer? Is the answer option 2, create a dynamic list to add the prospect to a campaign? Number 3, whenever a prospect has a title CMO, you want to add 15 points to that score. How would you do that? Option 1, create a completion action with criteria. Or option 2, create an automation rule with criteria. And number 4, mark any students or investors with the lead status unqualified. So maybe you have running a business and people with that job title, you don't want them in your system anymore. You want them to be a lead status unqualified. How would you do that? Option 1, create a dynamic list with prospect default field, job title, investor or student. Or would you create an automation rule with criteria and the action to change the lead status value to unqualified? Last one. Every time a prospect fills out a contact us form, notify Scott and create a lead. 2 choices. Option 1, add a completion action to the contact us form to notify Scott and assign. Or would you do it with all the actions that you see in option number 2, add an automation rule for the prospect form, contact us to notify Scott? All right, so I'm going to just go through the answers quick. So you can just, like I said, compare, kind of see how you did. So number 1, how do you add a prospect to an email? It's option 1. You would create a dynamic list and add that dynamic list to the engagement studio, right? And so that gives you a nice feature of like, anytime somebody is like filling out a form or anytime somebody clicks on a website, that's going to be grabbing people and putting them through that engagement studio. Add a prospect to a campaign when they click on the email. And it's also not option number 1. Add a completion action to the email to add them, right? Because you can see a dynamic list simply creates a list. So you would need a completion action in this. So option 1 is correct. Number 3, whenever a prospect has a title CMO, you want to add 15 points to the score. So that is number 2, create an automation with the criteria of CMO and add the action of add 15 points because it's criteria based, right? So I'm looking for criteria. So if you go to that decision tree, it's a criteria and it's got action. So that's option number 2. Number 4 is also option number 2 because I'm trying to identify investors with a certain identify students or investors and change the lead status. So dynamic list will identify them, but I'm not doing anything with it. So I actually need to do the action as well. So that's why for number 4, I'm actually, I need to change the prospect custom field to unqualified. So 2 is correct. And number 5, every time a prospect fills out a form, notify Scott and create a lead. The big difference here between option 1 and 2 is that I still need to assign it. So you can see option 2 only notifies Scott, which basically just means an email is going to be sent. In option 1, we need an email sent and we actually need to create a lead. And the only way to do that is to assign it. So option 1 is correct. So again, hopefully that gives you a little bit of a stronger base. Like Brian said, this is recorded as well. So I actually find when I found good sessions, I'd go back and listen to them again. And I can't stress enough, if I were you and a beginner or you're attending the session, go find that cookbook because there's some really good examples in there. So hopefully that gave you enough time there, Brian.
Yeah.
Is there a couple questions?
Yes. You can stop sharing if you'd like.
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, we have a number of questions here. Laura Black is actually in the session. So she's been answering some questions as well, which is
Thanks,
awesome
Laura.
to have Pardot Pro support here. And so
that's funny. I would have called you out, Laura, when I was actually referencing an experienced consultant, like when I was talking about dynamic lists. That was you.
That's awesome.
So cool.
Yeah, so she actually sent a blog post in answer to one of these questions about removing explicit words and names from prospect records. So I'm not going to go through that. That was in the post. But then one that came up and was supported by some others in the chat was what criteria would you use in a dynamic list to help clean up the database when you've reached the database limit in Pardot? So like cleaning your org.
Yeah. Like the quickest answer that I have that is I actually do have a blog on that. If you Google dynamic lists, cleaning an org or cleaning your database with dynamic lists, you can find it. So I would actually say that, like, that's going to be the quickest way, because it's hard to give like a quick explanation over over the over.
We'll find that blog post
Yeah.
and post that.
It happens to be mine, but I'm open to other ones. Like Salesforce has a really good documentation on explaining how to clean your database, but they don't give you dynamic list examples. So I feel like the blog complements it pretty well, and it gives you a much more comprehensive approach on how to clean your database up, because it'll give you, I think I have like 6 or 8 different examples of dynamic lists for that.
Yeah, and those
thanks, Aaron.
the spot also has that as well.
Yeah,
okay.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Yeah. It doesn't need to be my blog. I'm most familiar with my blog.
Of course. Okay, so let's see that. Back to the automation rules for lead scoring. The question from Brittany is the plus/minus necessary before the number in the adjust score by X? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're just trying to adjust the score by 5, I think if you just put 5, it'll add 5. But if you truly intend to decrease the score, you need to put the minus. So I guess the plus is probably optional if you're intending to increase it, but for sure, if to decrease it, you need the negative sign.
Now, I know we didn't get purposefully did not get into the repeat rule, but do you want to give a little deeper explanation of what?
Yeah, that's fair. I know. It's hard to go through it. Like honestly, when I train on this, it's broken up. I just chunk it differently, and I go in a little bit deeper. But it's really when you're starting, like, I don't know many people that start with a repeating automation rule. So to me, what happens is that in my example, like an automation rule, it's a lifetime membership. So once it runs, it's done. So I find the repeat is especially helpful for like scoring and score decay. So like if a prospect has been unengaged, you might say every month, I want to reduce the score. And I need to use an automation rule for that, because it's one of the tools that you can actually adjust score in. So you need a repeat functionality. So like I'm going to adjust it today because they've been inactive for 30 days. So I'm going to decrease the score by 10, but now I want to wait 30 more days again. And now I want to run that automation rule to check to see if there's any more unengaged prospects. So I would say like and then you have criteria. So there's a checkbox, you can say repeat, and then it gives you some parameters like, do you want to repeat it every 30 days, 60 days? It gives you like a variable on a number of days. And then you can also say whether you want it unlimited, or if you want to limit how many times you will allow it to repeat.
Yep. Awesome. Okay. And then last question here is from Ashley. For automation rules, once they've run, if a prospect's data in the field changes, making it not align with the rule anymore, will they be removed, or once they're in, will they always be there?
Lifetime membership. They're always in there. Like I said, unless you're engaging on the repeat functionality. But so like I said, that's exactly why I added that slide. It's a common question I tend to get, is like that concept, because a dynamic list, you can add people and remove people automatically. With an automation rule, once they qualify for that one automation rule, they'll stay on that automation rule, even if that criteria changes.
Got it. There was also another question that I had answered with a blog post. It's from Kate, and she wondered if there was a way to make dynamic lists run faster. And the blog post I sent was really all about speeding up your general process times, and that making your system run faster will make your dynamic lists run faster. Do you have any other advice?
No, and I'm a huge advocate of the optimizer. So like if you haven't checked it out, I recommend you do. Even if you have green status, there's some really cool tools to help you manage your dynamic lists to keep them cleaned up. And the other good trick is to, when you create a dynamic list, archive it. So if you know it's for something that's going to be done, like a spring event, and that's going to be done, put an archive date on your dynamic list so that it gets archived. Because you start to accumulate 1,000 dynamic lists, you could see some system slowdown.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jen. This was amazing. Everybody, the chat was incredible. Thanks everybody for engaging there as well. So that's it for today's session. Thanks again for joining us. Special shout out to our sponsors for their support. Without them, really, Marjorie wouldn't be possible at all.